بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم صل على واشرح لي صدري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So every week we go over a hadith from the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi, and alhamdulillah today we are halfway exactly. We are on hadith 21. So without further ado, عن أبي عمرو وقيل أبي عمرو سفيان بن عبد الله رضي الله تعالى عنه قال: قلت يا رسول الله قل لي في الإسلام قولا لا أسأل عنه أحد غيرك. قال: قل آمنت بالله ثم استقم. رواه Muslim. So Sahabi by the name of Sufyan ibn Abdullah, may Allah be pleased with him, he said that he told the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "O Messenger of Allah, tell me a piece of advice that after I won't need any other advice, or I couldn't ask anyone else for this advice." And the Prophet ﷺ replied, he said, "Say, I believe in Allah, and then be steadfast." This was narrated by Imam Muslim. And so, we'll go over first of all the Sahabi. This is a Sahabi that we have not encountered yet, Sufyan ibn Abdullah. Some say Ibn Amr, some say Ibn Amr, Abu Amr or Abu Amr. And he is a Thaqafi. So this is a Sahabi maybe most of us haven't heard about. He is Thaqafi, which means he is from the city of Ta'if, which was one of the major cities. Originally that rejected the Prophet ﷺ, but eventually became Muslim. And he was from a delegation from Ta'if that came to visit the Prophet ﷺ, and he accepted Islam. And so after that visit from the delegation, as they were leaving, he asked the Prophet ﷺ for a piece of advice. And this was the advice that was given to him. In terms of the hadith that, or actually a little more on him, was that he ended up later in his life, he stayed in Medina for a little bit. And during the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu, he actually asked Sufyan to go back to Ta'if and be the minister for zakat, to collect zakat from people there, which was a big honor and responsibility at that time. So he was a very noble Sahaba. And he narrates, most people say that this is the only Sahih hadith that he narrates. It's narrated by Imam Muslim and Imam Tirmidhi. And then a scholar by the name of Mullah Ali Qari says that he actually narrates 5 total hadith, but from amongst the Sahih, this is the only one. And the Tirmidhi narration differs a little bit. It adds a piece at the end. And he said, after asking for this advice, he said, "What do you fear the most from me?" And the Prophet ﷺ then held his tongue, or in another narration, he pointed to the tongue, and he said, "This," pointing to the tongue. And so that is in line with a lot of hadith that talk about how serious it is to control your tongue and your speech. But that is, inshallah, a conversation for another time, or that we've had before. So in terms of this hadith, all the hadith we've covered so far, and all the hadith that we're going to cover, demonstrate a concept called Jawami al-Kalim. This is a gift that Allah gave the Prophet ﷺ. It's called Jawami al-Kalim. It's kind of comprehensiveness in language. He has the ability to completely convey ideas in very succinct, clear language. Whenever you hear a hadith, it's always very short. قُلْ آمَنْتُ بِاللَّهِ ثُمَّ اسْتَقِمْ. That's the hadith. Very short, but there is so much that you can get into. There's so much written about it. You can go hours and hours researching and studying and not get to the end of it. So it's kind of one of the traits of the Prophet ﷺ that's unique to him. And we'll see in this hadith, I think, highlighted especially. So Islam generally has 2 broad components to it, and that is Tawheed, which is monotheism, like a radical monotheism, believing in only one God, and Ta'ah, which is like obedience to Allah. And so in this hadith, it kind of goes over those 2 branches of Islam. It says, say Allah is one, which is Tawheed, and then be steadfast, Ta'ah. And it relates to a lot of different verses in the Quran, but one that we'll bring up now is in Surah Hud, which is Surah number 11, verse 112. It says, فَاسْتَقِمْ كَمَا أُمِرْتَ وَمَنْ تَابَ مَعَكَ وَلَا تَطْغَوْا إِنَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ بَصِيرٌ. It says that Allah tells us, or tells the Prophet ﷺ, be firm just as you have been commanded by Allah, as well as those who have repented with you, and do not transgress. Indeed, He sees all that you do. This is in Surah Hud. And on this verse, this was one of the heaviest verses in the Quran on the Prophet ﷺ. He was so worried. He wasn't worried about him being steadfast. He was worried about his ummah remaining steadfast and how difficult that would be. It was so difficult upon him that Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who we mentioned a couple of hadiths ago, we mentioned how he was one of the foremost Sahaba in terms of tafsir and understanding of the Quran and its context, and he said that no verse was more difficult and severe upon the Prophet ﷺ than this. And he narrates a story where the Sahaba said that you've grayed so fast, which means that you've aged all of a sudden. Like, why did you age all of a sudden? And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Shaybatni Hud wa akhawatuha," which means that Hud, this surah, has caused me to gray, as well as its siblings. And he mentioned it in specific reference to this ayah about istiqamah. And so we'll get into it a little bit more, and then maybe a little more context on that. Is the Prophet ﷺ, even as he got older in his 50s and early 60s, the Sahaba thought he would never age. They thought he was going to live into like his hundreds and just keep going and not age, because he had so much energy and health, and he had no white hairs until like very late in age. But then after this verse, like some signs of aging started appearing on the Prophet ﷺ, and so the Sahaba were shocked, like, how did this happen? And so the Prophet ﷺ said that this is how much this verse weighed him down. And this is a man who lost his parents, who was an orphan, lost his wife, lost his uncle, lost so many of his close companions. And despite all that, this verse weighed him down that much. So that's kind of tells us the severity and importance of this. And so, we'll go over different aspects of it, but one, takeaway from this is that good deeds are really incomplete without istiqamah, without being steadfast. And, a good example for us to maybe understand that's very simple is it's kind of like a gym membership. Like people who sign up at the beginning of the year with a New Year's resolution, we're going to go to the gym, do this, do that. They start out at the beginning of the year and then they drop off, right? You come by summertime and no one's at the gym anymore. And so those people are not going to see the results. And it's the same thing, like we can't expect something different in the deed. Just because you start a deed, just because you have a good intention, doesn't mean you're going to see the results if you're not steadfast. And that's why it's so important. And same thing like you'll see in business, like people have all these business ideas and talk about it and get excited, but then they don't follow through and do the action, so there's no result at the end if they're not steadfast. That applies in the dunya, it applies to our deeds and religious affairs and all that. And so we'll go over the first part, which is believing in Allah. So what does it mean to believe in Allah? So there's like a legal definition for it, and so that is to believe with the heart, attest with the tongue, and to follow up with good deeds and actions. So that's very encompassing, but it's kind of cut and dry. There's a lot more to it, a lot more soul to it. But it's basically like that's kind of the summary of it. There is on this hadith actually. So this hadith there's a book called Mishkat al-Masabih. I'm going to try to keep this part brief because you can keep going, I think. But there's a book called Mishkat al-Masabih, which is essentially, if you imagine like the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi, but there wasn't a 40 hadith limit, and you were trying to just talk about every aspect of Islam, like the fiqh and the aqidah, like what do you believe, how do you practice your religion, like how do you know the attributes of Allah, like how do you describe the Prophet ﷺ. All these different things are found in Mishkat al-Masabih. It just brings hadith one after the other that explain these things. And on a commentary by Imam Allama al-Tibi, he comments on that collection, and on this hadith he has like a whole volume on just like this hadith basically, and he goes in depth, and you could spend like a month studying just that basically commentary. But some cool things that he brings forward is this kind of, drew it out like a diagram here, basically this idea of true belief, he says, has 16 parts to it, and we won't go over them, but like some examples are seeking knowledge, knowing Allah, knowing His attributes, Tawheed, which is that monotheism, Qadr, like fate, the Day of Judgment, your accountability, a weighing of deeds, Jannah, Nar. All these things are parts of belief, and each one of those has different commentaries and explanations, and you go deeper. That's kind of all the things that we believe. And then in terms of the steadfastness, those are manifested in deeds and our actions. And so if you take actions and you split it up, there's actions that relate to yourself, so like actions that affect you. There are actions that relate to the immediate circle around you, so your friends, your family, your neighbors, and those things have 8 components to it. And then there's actions that relate to the community as a whole, or the population in general, and he goes into 17 components of that. And you go back to actions that affect yourself, you can split that into internal and external. And if you take the internal, you can split that into tanqih, which is removing, and tahliya, which is beautification. So there's attributes you need to remove, attributes you need to add to beautify yourself. Examples of things you should remove are like eating too much, drinking too much, stinginess, pride, love for wealth, love for fame, love for worldly pleasures, jealousy, ostentation. Those are some examples of things to remove from the self. And then things to beautify, to add, repentance, fear of Allah, modesty, gratitude, contentedness, patience, discipline, sincerity, honesty, love, trust of Allah, acceptance of fate. This is kind of a guide to tazkiyah, purification of yourself, improving yourself, self-improvement. And that all comes from just this hadith. Like these are all just reflections of this hadith. So as you can see, you can go very in depth in terms of like where to take this in improving yourself. I'm just trying to give you a taste in case anyone's interested to go deeper. But that's kind of the idea of like so much is encapsulated in just this very simple, very small hadith. So then we went over what is belief, what is istiqamah. So that comes from the root of qawwama, which really has two kind of different meanings. One of it can mean refer to a group of people, which is you see like in Qawm Nuh, Qawm Lut. It's like the nation of or the group of people of someone. And the other one is to be erect or be determined. It could also mean like the straight path or balanced or to be just. So those are kind of different ways that that word is used. It's kind of hard. It doesn't make sense when you translate it to English, but that's kind of the meanings that it encapsulates in Arabic. And so it's actually one of the words, one of the names of Allah al-Qayyum, which refers to like this, eternity, lack of an end, or not having an end. And it's not that he needs to be like put on the right path. It's that he guides others to the right path, and he sustains all. And so it's kind of like this very broad meaning. But when it's used Islamically, it has like a technical definition. And so Imam Ibn Rajab, he mentions that one way to define that technical term is to take the straight path without deviation, which consists of doing good, avoiding bad, internally and externally. And that's kind of what's meant in Surah Al-Fatiha, Sirat al-Mustaqim. It's the same root, istiqamah, mustaqim. And that's kind of like what we make dua for every single day from Allah. And Imam Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he mentions that it's to hold firmly to the command of Allah in actions and leaving what he told us to leave. So that's kind of like what we're meant here. It's kind of like that firmness in action. And so this hadith is like almost, a paraphrase of another ayah in the Quran in Surah Fussilat. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبَّنَا اللَّهُ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا. So, for indeed those who say that Allah is our Lord, and then they are steadfast on that. And then the ayah goes on to describe how angels will descend upon them and tell them to not have fear, and they'll give them glad tidings of Jannah. And so this hadith almost paraphrases this ayah in the Quran. And there's many places in the Quran where this, this idea of istiqamah is mentioned. Surah Fatiha, as we went over, it's also mentioned in Surah Yasin, إِنَّكَ مِنَ الْمُرْسَلِينَ عَلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ again, and then there's Surah Hud, which we went over. It's mentioned twice in Surah Fussilat. And so it's like, it's a common theme in the Quran, and that also shows us how important it is. And so some reflections from the Sahaba, Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he said that what it really means is to be firm in your monotheism, in your belief in, one Allah, like Allah not having any partners and that there's only one God. And that's what the verses in the Quran refer to. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, who we mentioned earlier, as well as Hassan al-Basri and Qutadah, who are great scholars, they say that it means to remain firm, particularly in obeying the commands of Allah. And then another one, Abu Ali, who says it means really sincerity in your actions until you die. So it's kind of like the sincereness of your actions, your intentions. And then another beautiful way to define it is that your internal is consistent with your external. And I think that kind of brings together these concepts very, very beautifully. And so as we wrap it up, inshallah, it's kind of going back to this idea of taking steadfastness very seriously. We talked about how seriously the Prophet ﷺ took this concept, took those verses of the Quran, and so that should be reflected in our own lives and how seriously we take this and trying to work on this action. Some of its virtues, Ibn Taymiyyah mentions a really beautiful thing. أعظم الكريمات لزام الاستقامة. So like amongst the greatest miracle is being consistent in your consistency, being consistent in your steadfastness. And so being firm on that steadfastness is the greatest miracle, because a lot of people maybe not as much now, but especially in the past, a lot of people would look for miracles of scholars and that's like a proof of the righteousness. And he's saying that there's no greater miracle than just being steadfast on the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and just like seeking that righteousness. And that's really the greatest gift, because kirama comes from gift, and it's a gift from Allah, and Allah can't give you a better gift than being steadfast on His path. And so some questions we can reflect on for ourselves to really assess our station in terms of our steadfastness. Are we the same in the masjid and at home and at school or work? Do we do in public what we do in private, and vice versa? Would we do something differently if our mother was watching us? Or what if the Prophet ﷺ was there and watching us? So then what about when Allah is watching us, which is always, how would we act differently when we're cognizant of these things? And when we start something, do we tend to finish it, or do we tend to kind of like start it and then the excitement fades and we stop it, or do we do things like a half-baked job, or do we like really commit when we start something? So those are kind of like questions we can ask ourselves to reflect on how steadfast we're being in our actions, whether it's like in Islam or just generally in life and other things. And so, Mu'adh ibn Jabal radiallahu anhu, he asked the Prophet ﷺ for advice when he was traveling one day, and he said, the Prophet ﷺ told him to believe in Allah and ascribe no partners. And so then Mu'adh said, like, what else? Like, what's more advice? And he says, if you do bad, follow it with good. And then he said, what else? And he said, be steadfast and beautify your character, which kind of summarizes these things very beautifully. And then just the last point, because this is always a question, it's like, this all sounds awesome. How do we actually do it in our lives? And so Jamal al-Badi, he has a commentary on the 40 hadith of Nawawi. So on this hadith, he mentions kind of like a 5-step plan on how to do this. So the first part is musharata, which means to kind of start a commitment. So just pick an action, make a commitment to do it like wholeheartedly. Then the next step is mujahada, and that is to struggle to fulfill that commitment. No pain, no gain, that kind of concept. And then there is muraqaba, which is to review the action once you do it. It's like, how will that go? Am I being consistent? Then after that comes muhasaba, which means accountability. So however that manifests for you, might be like a reward and punishment system or whatever works for you. Just hold yourself accountable to that action, maybe telling a friend. And then last thing is tahseen. So it's kind of like this praxis of like improving that action. Once you reflect on it, you're like, how can I do it better next time? And just keep going through it. And the last 2 points that Mufti Kamani added to that was that, like every hadith, the advice was stick with good people. It'll make it easier. You'll learn from them. So if you want to implement the character of the Prophet ﷺ, find people who have that pieces of that character and then try to copy them and be with them. And then also when you fail, say Bismillah, try again. He mentioned a really cool quote, black belts or just white belts that didn't give up. It's a really cool quote. It applies to this. Just be consistent. And we'll end with the dua of Hassan al-Basri when he came across those verses that we mentioned earlier. He said, Allahumma anta rabbana farzuqna al-istiqamah. Oh Allah, you are our Lord, so grant us istiqamah, inshallah. Jazakallah.